1994 was the year I left behind my 16-bit Sega Genesis console and stepped into the world of PC gaming. PC games had never impressed me much before then, but I used to spend a lot of time in supermarkets leafing through gaming magazines, and starting in 1993, I began seeing these amazing looking ads for this little indie game you probably never heard of. It's just called Doom. At some point I was at an electronics store where they had Doom running on a demo PC, and I only needed to play a few minutes of it to know that I had to have this game. Fast forward a few years. By 1996, Doom was getting a bit stale. Luckily that year would be a new dawn for first-person shooters. That's the year Duke Nukem 3D exploded onto the scene.
Those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride.
Based on the build engine and designed by 3D Realms, Duke Nukem 3D took the first-person shooter out of the dark halls of futuristic colonies on the moons of Mars and set itself in a colorful, contemporary world here on Earth. Whereas in Doom you could generally only interact with switches, lifts, and teleporters, Duke 3D let you interact with dozens of everyday and not so everyday objects. Switch lights off and on, or just blow them up. Use toilets, play billiards, tip strippers, blow holes in walls, demolish buildings. You can go underwater, get shrunk down to the size of a rat, and do the same to your enemies. Set traps with pipe bombs and laser trip mines. You could ride subways and trams. The gameplay was absolutely incredible. And unlike Doom's silent protagonist, Duke Nukem is a living, breathing character with a personality, even if that personality is, well, being a dick.
You wanna dance?
It was crude and immature, but it was entertaining, and it was the time before somebody decided that deliberately making a silent protagonist is somehow more immersive, even though the protagonist has a name and an identity, and nobody would look at shit like this and not react or make a sound in any way. Later in 1996, Duke 3D would find itself dueling with Doom creator id Software's fully 3D shooter Quake. While Quake would later set the standard of FPS game design in favor of 3D modeling over 2D sprites, I wasn't too impressed with Quake at the time. The game's graphics weren't too impressive, especially on my system. The colors were drab and dull, and it really just felt like a reimagining of Doom, but in full 3D with an even less coherent story. This was well before the time when Quake's features would be fully exploited to their full potential. But while I sided with Duke Nukem against Quake at the time, it was getting old and I eagerly awaited something new. Around this time, PC gaming magazines had features and ads for two upcoming build engine games that gave rise to new hope. One was a ninja-themed game called Shadow Warrior, and the other one appeared to be a horror-themed game with a rather unusual art style. At the time, Shadow Warrior looked more interesting, but the other game, called Blood, was set to release earlier, conveniently just before the end of my freshman school year. So when the game's shareware episode released, I downloaded it from a Oh wait, hold on. Okay, I better explain this for younger viewers. Bear with me here. Back when I was a boy, PC games were often distributed as something we called shareware. The game would typically be divided into episodes, and the first one would be the shareware version that you could buy for a very low price. And if you liked the game, you could order the full version. For example, you could buy the first episode of Doom for $10 and still have enough money left over to buy a bomb pop and 2 boxes of lemon heads from the ice cream man. $10 was a lot of money in those days. And if you had one of these newfangled devices called a modulator-demodulator, or modem for short, you could even download the game for free. And when their modem was connecting, it would squeal like a robot pig being stabbed to death, unless you used something called an initialization string to silence it. You could download shareware games from the internet, but not everybody had it back then, and even if you did, it was really slow. So some of us would download games from these things called bulletin board systems, or BBSs. It was like a website that you called into with your modem, and then you could chat with one person, play text-based role-playing games, or download all kinds of text files. Some of them were instructions on making explosives written by people who'd never used a firearm, and others were sex tips written by people who had never had sex. And porn looked like this. What a time it was. So my friend and I got the first episode of Blood. I figured it would be a stopgap before Shadow Warrior released. What I couldn't know at the time, however, is that Blood would arguably be the superior game of what some would later refer to as the holy trinity of build engine games, alongside Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior. Whereas Duke Nukem 3D withered away into the long night of terrible spin-offs and the false promise of Duke Nukem Forever that would culminate in a terrible disappointment 15 years later, and Shadow Warrior was quickly forgotten as a racist embarrassment, Blood carved itself a special place in many of our hearts, and I have never had more of a desire to play through a build engine game for nostalgia's sake, the way I have with Blood. With its sequel a tragic failure and its official modern remake of the original appearing only in 2019, Blood has been largely forgotten by the masses, but has a strong following among gamers of a certain generation, myself included. Why? Because it's just so goddamn great, and I'm going to tell you all about it. When I say Blood is great, I mean just that. It is great, as in it is really hard to pick out one feature that stands out more than others. It's got intense combat, over-the-top 90s blood and gore, atmosphere, character, interactivity, unique weapons, tons of Easter eggs and humor, and what is more, it is hard. It's easily the most difficult game of the holy build engine trinity. So if I had to pick a place to start, I'd say the best feature of Blood is the combat. In this game, you simply wreak havoc on hordes of enemies, and it is incredibly satisfying, whether you're decapitating a zombie with a double-barrel shotgun blast and kicking its head around like a football, blasting enemies across the screen with bundles of dynamite, or my personal favorite when I was a teenager, lighting enemies on fire. You know what? Let's just let it speak for itself. Just look at this. From the very beginning of the game, you could tell it was going to be totally different from other FPS games. See, the standard FPS of the day traditionally started you off with a basic weapon like a pistol, and then you'd usually find a shotgun later in the level or at the beginning of the second level. Not in Blood, though. Oh no.
Oh my god. Oh no, I ain't messing with you. Oh no.
In Blood, you emerge from a crypt with nothing but a pitchfork. And no, it is not a devastating melee weapon like in later games. If you're observant, you'll find this secret with a crate of TNT. But the first flat trajectory weapon you'll find is a flare gun with 8 rounds. Why is this significant? Well, see, it's because it's entirely possible, albeit not probable, to go through the whole first level without a normal firearm that kills things dead. The dynamite bundles require you to hold and release the fire button at the right time in order to get them where they need to go. And the flare gun generally doesn't kill enemies quickly. Instead, it does this. On harder difficulty levels, the zombies actually take more than one flare to ignite and die, so you won't be getting a lot out of this flare gun in the beginning. An enemy may drop the double-barrel shotgun, but you won't have many shells for it until the next level. Bottom line here, you're up against a lot of enemies with improvised weapons, and they can kill you very quickly, so you need to use strategy. Such a steep difficulty curve was rather novel for an FPS game at the time. Even later games that started you off with only a melee weapon gave you something more effective than Blood's pitchfork. And they'd start you off with much weaker enemies too. But Blood doesn't give you a gentle learning curve. Blood doesn't care. It tosses you in the deep end, and you either sink or swim. On the other hand, once you do start acquiring weapons and sufficient ammo, you basically become the Angel of Death. And this is another area where the game shines, because you see, dear viewers, in Blood, you are not merely shooting enemies. You are blasting them to pieces, immolating them, scything them down like hay, generally just unmaking them. Just compare killing enemies with a shotgun in Duke Nukem 3D to doing the same in Blood. See the difference? But of course, one of the best things about Blood's combat is that your arsenal goes way beyond firearms. While Blood provides you with classic FPS weapons, you also have access to some of the most creative weapons to be seen in an FPS at the time and long after. In fact, one could argue that your most important weapon in the game isn't a firearm at all, but the dynamite bundles and their 2 variants. Not only do you need to master throwing them at attackers, the game's hit-scanning enemies often start taking chunks out of your health the second you step into their field of vision. The best way to deal with that is to toss dynamite around corners and banking it off walls so it lands close enough to do damage. And when it does, well... And remember that flare gun I mentioned? Well, once you have enough ammo, it can become one of your most devastating weapons, able to light a group of enemies ablaze using its alternate fire mode. And Blood's shotgun may seem like just an ordinary double-barreled shotgun, but please, take another moment to appreciate how much more destructive this thing is. Even the sound of it carries more weight than other FPS games in the era. And you can fire it one barrel at a time or both barrels for those frequent moments when you've just gotta decapitate a zombie fast. Next, you've got a Tommy gun, which doesn't seem too special, except when you get the gun's akimbo power-up that lets you wield two of them at the same time, so you can just cut down hordes of enemies in seconds. The napalm launcher is your standard FPS rocket launcher with one important difference. Instead of just doing splash damage to nearby enemies, it can actually light them on fire. And speaking of lighting enemies on fire, you have an aerosol can lighter combination that is very effective against small nuisance enemies, as well as some of the slower zombies. But the alt fire turns the can into a massive firebomb. As a teenager, hell, as an adult, my favorite thing in the game is trying to immolate as many enemies at once, and using the aerosol firebomb is one of the best ways to set records for that. Next, you have your ultra-powerful plasma rifle type weapon known as the Tesla cannon. Then you've got this crazy magic staff thing, and finally you've got the voodoo doll. Yes, there's a voodoo doll, and some enemies have a special animation when you kill them with it. But even with this vast arsenal of destruction, you are still extremely vulnerable. Blood's enemies are tough, both in terms of how much punishment they can take, but also what they dish out. Blood seems to have pioneered the concept of having common enemies that can do almost anything the player can do. The ubiquitous cultists can throw dynamite bundles, crouch to avoid your shots, and swim. And starting in episode 3, there's a fun little guy called the Hellhound who runs at you and spits fire which can ignite your player character just as you can do to enemies. The environment often plays an important role in combat as well. Cultists will catch on fire if you lure them into lava. Hellhounds can't swim and will actually drown if you get them to follow you into water. And these fishman creatures are much slower and less effective on land. And since we're talking about the environment, that brings us to the next great thing about Blood: atmosphere. 90s FPS games weren't known for having really deep plots. Not that simple plots can't be great ones, as in the case of Doom, but if you were a huge nerd like me and you took the time to go through the game's instruction manual, it actually has a fairly developed story compared to other games in the genre. So you play as Caleb, who was originally a gunslinger in the Old West. He falls in love with a woman named Ophelia Price, who happens to be a member of a cult called the Cabal, that worship a dark god called Chernobog. Of course, if you know any Slavic languages, you'll recognize the name Chernobog, which is the dark god of the pre-Christian Slavic pantheon. Anyway, Caleb is such a badass gunslinger that he's promoted to the Cabal's inner circle along with Ophelia in marketing, Ishmael, accounting, and Gabriel, human resources. For some reason, Chernobog isn't satisfied with his chosen's performance, so he basically murders all of them in order to make room for some fresh new faces. Later, in a sort of alternate history version of the 1920s, Caleb awakens in his grave and tries to avenge his lost love and comrades while inexplicably spouting one-liners from the Evil Dead series.
I live again.
Now, this isn't exactly Bioshock-level writing here, but I remember checking out the game's official website back in the day, and the developers actually went to the lengths of inventing a language for the cultist enemies that is based on a mixture of Latin and Sanskrit. Due to the sound recording quality, it was always kind of difficult to know exactly what the cultists were shouting, and it sounds really funny at times. But I can appreciate the extra effort to give the game's antagonists a little more depth. The game's story is actually told via these cutscenes that I could never actually get to play back when I had the DOS version of the game. By the time I actually saw them on YouTube in the 2000s, I realized I wasn't missing much at all. This animation was awful even for the era. But where the cutscenes failed, the actual game excels at storytelling with its level design and atmosphere. So you might remember how Duke Nukem 3D kicked off this concept of continuity between levels on a limited basis? Blood goes even further, where in some areas you start the next level exactly where you ended the one before it. Nowhere is this done better than in the first episode, aka the shareware episode that was supposed to impress you enough to buy the full version. Caleb rises from his grave and fights through a funeral home to a train yard. At the end of that level, a train pulls up to the platform. The next level takes place on that train, which you ultimately have to stop. It crashes at a carnival park. From there you can go to the secret level, a demented funhouse in the woods. And instead of just finding and flipping a hidden switch, you have this little puzzle whose answer is hinted at earlier in the level. Whether you go to the secret level or not, you find yourself at this temple, which has a ridiculously easy but pretty cool puzzle in it. The penultimate level has you climbing a temple that rises above the clouds, and finally you run into the first boss. Now I'll be the first to say that bosses are kind of one of the game's weaknesses. The first one is just a larger stone version of the gargoyles you fight, with a more powerful projectile attack. Plus, you can totally cheese him to death by simply crouching. It's some kind of bug. Probably only the third and final boss are actually a challenge, but I feel like this is all forgivable because Blood is less about bosses and endings than it is about the journey getting there. The shareware episode is such a great encapsulation of the game that I've played it countless times, both when the game was fresh and recently thanks to the modern remake. But the other episodes just get even better. As you continue through the game, you'll fight through more creepy horror-themed locations such as haunted houses, a hospital full of disturbing experiments, a mad scientist's laboratory, and an aquarium to name a few. Virtually all the levels feature hidden jokes and pop culture references as well.
Nevermore. I got time to play with you. Oh, shake it, baby.
Just to single out an extremely well-designed level in the latter episodes. In episode 2, you've got the Overlooked Hotel, yet another reference to The Shining. It's filled with secret passages that run throughout the level, and you can access the secret level if you can find these tomes hidden throughout the hotel. That level is probably the finest example of another great feature of the game's level design. See, not only do Blood's levels tend to have continuity, but they're also typically very non-linear, or at least have shortcuts that can take you back to other parts of the level quickly. Depending on things like ammo drops and your health, you can often approach a level in different ways. Contrast this to the Half-Life series, which is so linear and scripted it might as well be a rail shooter. Oh yeah, I insulted Half-Life. Yes, I will go there on this channel, and I know I'm not alone in this. So that pretty much sums up Blood. It had 2 expansion packs, both of which were added into the Fresh Supply remake. But when it came to making a sequel, tragedy struck. Long story short, the designers at Monolith were rushed into releasing Blood 2, The Chosen, long before it was ready. And the result was a buggy mess that arguably ruined the series. If you want to see just how bad it was, there's another YouTuber you should definitely check out named Civi11. He's got a lot of great videos on Blood, and he actually subjected himself to a full playthrough of the terrible sequel. Personally, I didn't play much Blood 2, and what I did play was around the year 2000. I don't remember it being quite as terrible as it was for Civi, and I remember even mildly enjoying it, but it definitely was a huge letdown. While Monolith managed to survive the failure of Blood 2, Blood itself was largely forgotten, and for those of us that remember it, it was something like lightning in a bottle. Blood was by no means just a Duke 3D clone. Besides the build engine and the one-liners from Army of Darkness, Blood had a radically different gameplay style. And nowadays, you look at ultra-successful remakes like Doom 2016, or even a game like Ion Fury, which runs on the actual build engine, and you can't help but wonder, why not Blood? Imagine how great that would be, recreating the saga of Caleb and his fight against the Cabal with modern technology. Naturally, a successful Blood saga would need to capitalize on what made the original series great and build off of that. For example, unique weapons, including improvised ones, non-linear level design, a lot of interactivity. Duke Nukem Forever may have been a colossal failure, but one thing it did well was giving you a lot of things to interact with. Creepy atmosphere. Modern graphics can make a much scarier environment. One thing I liked about Blood's setting is that it seems to take place outside of time, almost like a parallel universe. Whatever's happening, it's not the ordinary 1920s. I find this disorientation foreboding, and that's exactly what you want in a game like this. Finally, tell an interesting story. We've come a long way from the terrible CGI of the mid to late 90s, and Blood had a fairly solid story that deserves to be fleshed out. And of course these days, blood and gore in video games isn't scandalous the way it was in the 90s, but the game is called Blood, so the macabre aesthetic and dark humor would be essential. I haven't seen anything to indicate that any big developers are considering such a project, but we can always hope, I guess. Blood truly is a unique icon of 90s PC gaming. Without a decent sequel, it became something like a one-hit wonder with, appropriately enough, a cult-like following. Personally, Blood always conjures up interesting memories for me. Recently I was watching a video essay about nostalgia, and the host was talking about how, for millennials and Gen Z, the appeal of nostalgia comes from dealing with the instability and crises starting from 9/11, the 2008 economic collapse, and the recent COVID pandemic and the recession associated with it, which all inevitably create a desire to remember what seemed like more stable, simpler times. I don't disagree with that sentiment, although it doesn't really apply to me because, first of all, I'm older. I was an adult and out of the house when 9/11 happened. And also, like a lot of people, my childhood and teenage years weren't exactly a time of stability and fond memories. In fact, I'd say my high school days straight up sucked, for the most part. But Blood came out right at this time when everything seemed to be going well. I just finished my freshman year, I had my first job, there was great music on the radio, great movies. My friend and I would take turns playing through the shareware episode of Blood over and over again. And maybe because the series all but died out after the sequels flopped, it sort of preserved Blood as this unique game associated with a relatively finite, short time period. Obviously the game does have a cult following, so my experiences can't be called universal, but that's just what Blood meant to me personally. In 2019, when the remake came out, I started a new game with the shareware episode, and though I was no longer playing it with just a keyboard as I did back in 1997, all those habits and tactics I developed came back instinctively. And it was like a time-traveling experience that I can't really say I've had playing other games from my youth, not even Doom. Perhaps absence really does make the heart grow fonder. Or maybe it's just that Blood is a really goddamn good game. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed the review. If you want to know more about Blood, I can highly recommend you check out the work of Civi11 that I mentioned earlier. I've put a link to his channel in the description below. And speaking of descriptions, if you look down there, you'll find the link to my Patreon page, and you can also follow me on Twitter. And like every YouTuber, I'm going to ask you to click like and subscribe. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.